There's this movie that came out on Disney Channel in 2006 called Wendy Wu: Homecoming Warrior. Initially indistinguishable from the myriad of other schlocky American teen dramas that came out in the mid-2000s, about a decade too late for them to actually reflect teenage life anymore, Wendy Wu sets itself apart by being a martial arts movie. In the film, the lead character Wendy, an Americanized girl of Chinese descent played by a Thai woman, is led by a Chinese monk played by a Japanese man, to realize, along with her entire family, that being American isn't for them, and adopts what the film posits to be inherently innate and superior Chinese values in order to defeat an ancient evil Chinese villain. And I say Chinese with full air quotes. And I kinda hate this message. But not the movie, it's actually pretty fun. This statement sends a clear message to second and third generation immigrants that it is not the culture you practice based on the people you identify with and accept you that should be your own, but rather culture must be attributed to the color of your skin. Wendy's family has yellow skin, therefore they must shake off their American ways and live as a Chinese-American family. I understand that the West has an interest in bashing itself in its media these days, and I guess for a long time, but to me, this comes off as a little too self-critical. The film fails to recognize the nuances of being a second-generation immigrant of Asian descent within a Western country, and what it means to recognize that your ancestral culture is not your own. It provides an overly simplistic solution to an overly complicated problem. There's one particular line in the film where Wendy's father remarks that he wishes to be a Chinese-American family.
It was just when I saw these mooncakes, it was like I was a boy again, and then I felt guilty that I grew up, turning my back on all this. I don't want to do that anymore. I want us to be a Chinese-American family.
What the f does that even mean?
Yet he's actually saying that he wants to be like a Chinese stereotype that he doesn't understand. Now, quite laughably, he bases the statement on eating autumn mooncakes in June and says that he has now experienced traditional Chinese culture for the first time. This calls into question what the difference between American and Chinese American is. Could you imagine how strange a statement that would be coming from an American of Anglo-Saxon descent, saying to his wife, "I want to be an Anglo-Saxon American family." What does that even look like? Based on what? The color of your skin? Racists. And yet, there's another movie that came out 15 years later and also stars Tai Chin as a Chinese grandmother to an immigrant family, centering on a young Chinese American who has lost touch with their culture, finding an older Chinese man who instructs them to tap into their innate martial arts skills in order to defeat an evil creature from China. That movie is called Shang Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings, and it somehow gets it right. How does it do this? How does Shang Chi address the second-generation immigrant identity crisis and provide a more nuanced understanding of what it is like to be a so-called whitewashed Asian? This is Shang Chi and the Legend of the Second-Generation Identity Crisis.
Years ago, I was Chinese. Now, I'm a naturalized...
As an artist, you sometimes find yourself being hired to create art you don't agree with. I remember one incident in which my client wished me to create concept art for a fantasy series set within a fictional made-up world. The client wished to represent many different people of varying ethnicities within this world, but asked for elements of the cultures those ethnicities were tied to, for example, language, religion, etc., as things that would be introduced in this made-up world. The client seemed to believe that your ethnicity was tied to your culture, and, by the way, no slight against this client, they were actually pretty fun to work with. However, this experience has always stuck with me as an illustration of how underrepresented the second-generation identity crisis was, and how inextricably linked culture and race have become, and how they really shouldn't be. Thus, you can imagine my surprise at how Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings, a 2021 film from one of the largest studios in the world, directly addressed an issue this unknown on a stage as big as theirs. By using cultural shorthand to assign each character in the film to a certain idea related to the experience of growing up as a second-generation immigrant in an action movie, where naturally these characters will come to exchange blows, Shang-Chi effortlessly depicts and presents a solution to the identity crisis felt not only by myself, but millions of other descendants of immigrants across the world. For those not familiar with the second-generation immigrant identity crisis, please allow me to share a brief anecdote. My parents, who are from the British territory of Hong Kong, gave me a Chinese name at birth. In Chinese culture, names always have meanings and are objects of great significance. My Chinese name, on the other hand, is quite literally Yat, or one. And it is this way to mark my place as their firstborn son. It is as insignificant as a number. In Chinese, it is literally a numerical digit, as in 1, not O-N-E, but 1. When I asked my parents as to why this name was so devoid of meaning, they provided me a simple answer. You are in Canada now, and you will likely never use your Chinese name. Thus, there is no reason as to why your Chinese name should have more meaning to you, as Chinese culture likely means nothing to you. In one of his books, Australian writer Tom Cho writes about the idea of a name. He states that names in Chinese often express a wish that their parent has for their child. To the tradition of the name being significant, my name seemed like an appropriation or an affront. This is the experience of the second-generation immigrant, having just enough immersion in your parents' culture so as to have key elements of that culture in your everyday life, but not actually enough that anyone would accept you as being of that culture. In my case, I was just Eastern enough to be considered a foreigner by Westerners, but just Western enough to be considered a foreigner by Easterners. In a world that is increasingly tied to ideas of identity and family, what happens when one does not know enough of a language to communicate with their own grandparents? One could say that you could just pick up one and move on with your life, but another problem arises. When you practice a culture that is not yours, that is what is known as cultural appropriation in the modern sense. To some, this may not be an issue, as surely they do not act in jest. For example, I think criticizing white people of wearing kimonos is a step too far. To others, including myself, I feel as if I am being inauthentic if I act in this way. One cannot deny who they are, but some also do not know who exactly they are, and thus what they cannot deny is that they have no idea. This leads to the other proposed solution: combination. One is called to combine the Eastern and Western parts of themselves into one person. However, combining cultures is purely a Western concept, and thus by living as both cultures, you still admit defeat by living as one. The issue becomes even more complicated when you realize that many Eastern cultures, being largely of a single ethnicity, have never had to grapple with these sorts of things, and thus questioning identity isn't even part of that culture. So by now, I believe you can see how difficult the question becomes. What happens when one can speak too much of that language, and that it makes them seem like an other to potential friends? What happens when you are estranged from your traditional and contemporary identity in equal measure? This is the struggle presented to our main character, Shang Chi, in Shang Chi.
Moving on is an American idea. You're American, Mom, don't forget.
As a movie, Shang-Chi assigns each of the degrees of immersion in their home culture a second-generation immigrant can have over their lifetime to a character and represents that in the story. Our protagonist, Shang Xu, Chinese name Xu Shangqi, was born in China and was immersed in Chinese culture from birth but decided to run away and live his formative and adult years in San Francisco, America. We know that Sean's actor, Simu Liu, wanted to aim Shang-Chi at people like himself, Asians who grew up primarily immersed in Western culture. Liu writes, "I wanted to be one that continues to fight for representation and continues to build out the culture for Western-raised Asians." Throughout the film, a question is proposed to Sean, and by extension, the audience of second-generation immigrants that this movie was made for.
Who are you?
In another instance, the character of Wenwu asks Sean,
I gave you 10 years to live your life, and where did it get you?
Sometimes, Sean gets answers presented to him. For example, the character of Yingnan tells him,
You are a product of all who came before me.
this is the question Sean must answer by the end of the story. Thus, he stands at a crossroads between two cultures that pull him in opposite directions, preventing him from coming to an easy answer. As the son of the leader of the Ten Rings crime syndicate, Sean's Chinese side is represented by him training as an assassin where he was
taught every possible way to kill a man.
using Chinese martial arts. However, he does not know everything. Later in the film, when encountering the commonly known Chinese mythological creature, a Daigong, he freaks out and asks what he is looking at.
Oh! What is that? What is that? Oh! Who?
What's wrong?
That! What is that?
Meanwhile, his western side is represented by the life he leads with deuteragonist Katie Chen, working as a valet driver and going clubbing after work. Both of these concepts originated in the West. Sean represents the second-generation immigrant who is caught between a crossroads of two cultures, the dramatic impasse forcing him to choose between one or the other occurring when he is suddenly attacked by the Ten Rings one day, and roped into his father's plots once again. Katie, on the other hand, knows little of Chinese culture. She can understand Chinese, but cannot speak it.
世界来了，你的车技实在是太帅了。
Oh, my Chinese sucks.
All good. I speak ABC.
This may be strange to those who do not know what it is like to be a second-generation immigrant, but it is a true struggle to many and has to do with how the brain learns languages. Katie struggles in the film with the role her mother wishes for her to play, a studious Eastern portrait of a passive, docile, and serious girl who is always studying.
Look at that girl. She's writing a research paper on a bus. That is exactly the daughter my mom wishes came out of her.
As her mother says,
My Gong didn't move here from Hunan so you could park cars for a living.
instead, she is crass, witty, combats racism, and sings Hotel California when she gets in a fight, which she suggests to her mother earlier in the film to move on from the death of their grandfather. Her mother returns with a lesson.
Moving on is an American idea.
In other words, Katie represents the second-generation immigrant with no desire to be within her ancestral culture whatsoever, but can feel its influence bearing down on her nonetheless. Along with Sean, they are modernity personified. She joins Sean on his journey to Macau when he learns his sister is also being threatened by the Ten Rings and are subsequently captured and brought before Sean's father, Shu Wenwu. Wenwu is Chinese culture and archaic tradition incarnate. Wenwu has lived quite literally for 10 centuries in China, during which time he has become connected with the land and its culture completely. This is most symbolized by his engagement with the idea of moving on, an American concept. He completely rejects this notion, instead burying himself in the pursuit of bringing his deceased wife back from the dead at all costs. Whereas Katie's grandmother refuses to accept that her husband may be dead by still reserving him a seat at the table, Wenwu takes this several steps further by never even referring to his wife as gone, only held captive, and has devised an elaborate plan to retrieve her from where he believes she is being held, the protected village of Talo. When Sean, his sister Xiaoling, and Katie learn about Wenwu's plan to destroy Talo in order to supposedly get their mother, who he can hear calling to him, they decide to venture there first in order to stop him as they see Wenwu as clearly misguided. In the words of Katie,
Your dad should definitely see a therapist for his delusions.
whilst in Talo, the trio learn of a monster hiding in a mountain in the village who has been calling to Wenwu using his wife's voice, trying to trick him into freeing it. Later revealed to be a Western-style dragon, this Dweller in Darkness is only countered by the Great Protector, an Eastern-style dragon who lives in the lakes of Talo. Is that you? Given that the Dweller in Darkness mainly attacks people by sucking their souls out, and somebody in the village comments that one can extrapolate that the Dweller in Darkness and the Great Protector represent the Eastern and Western soul, respectively. As Wenwu and the Ten Rings arrive in the village, Shang Chi lives up to its name as an action movie, and our diverse range of ideologies fight. This is a crisis, an identity crisis. Their conflict directly mimics the turbulent thought process of a second-generation immigrant before a solution to their conflict is presented. And what a nuanced solution this film presents. Before the battle starts, Sean has a quiet calm before the storm when he reflects on how his father made him do terrible things and how he wishes to kill him. Keeping in mind that everything Sean knows about killing is derived from Chinese martial arts, and that through shot composition and the lighting, the film is communicating to us that Sean is at his lowest point, signaling that giving into one culture's practices when you stand at the crossroads of two, in this case Chinese, is specifically wrong. In time, the battle begins and Sean finds himself dueling with Wenwu inside a hall for ancestor worship. While Wenwu fights so he can simply reach the wife he thinks is calling to him, Sean initially starts off the fight simply trying to resist his father out of rage and seemingly not for any deeper motivation. However, he is struck down at the lake by a powerful blow. He remembers the dialogue he had with his mother before her death, in which she urges him to take what her and his father, his Chinese side, have given to him and make it his own. Renewed with purpose, Sean finds the Great Protector and rides it out of the lake to confront his father once more. Taking into account what his mother said, Sean uses what his father taught him, Chinese martial arts, to fight for the idea of moving on, an American idea. In essence, Sean does the unthinkable and synthesizes the two sides together. Typically, when a second-generation immigrant tries this, they will end up facing challenges from both their Western and Eastern sides, throwing them questions of if they are really a perfect mixture, or if they're just pretending.
还要装多久？
Similarly, Wenwu goes at Sean, fighting back and challenging him. He wants Sean to stand by his side and not let him go,
They will come back once I bring her home.
and will fight him to prove it. However, Sean stands by his beliefs and does not back down, exercising some very Eastern concepts of honor to bring back his Western ideals. Such tenacity is rarely seen in Western media, usually being regulated only to the realm of anime, like Dragon Ball Z or My Hero Academia. Indeed, such references to an Eastern mindset seem to be deliberate, as later on in the movie, Katie references the Kamehameha by name.
She hit it dead on.
And then Sean used the 10 rings to do this crazy Kamehameha fireball that exploded the thing.
More specific to Shang Chi, Sean has a scene where he reflects on how he beat a training dummy in China until his fists were bloodied and then continued to beat it. Again, he relies on his Eastern training to back up his Western ideals. In essence, Sean chooses the path of synthesis, a Western concept, but he achieves this Western concept in an Eastern way, thus mixing the East into the reasoning behind a Western idea and mixing the East with the West. Whereas the idea of combination held before in this essay was superficial and surface level, this is a true synthesis, down to the motivation itself. It is in this moment that I realize Shang-Chi's solution to the second-generation immigrant identity crisis, that Sean takes all 10 of his father's rings of power and rises. Finally, to seal Sean's fate, Wenwu accidentally releases the Dweller in Darkness and is subsequently killed. In his dying moments, he says nothing, and his eyes communicate a mixed expression. He is torn about Sean's conviction, not sure if he should accept or admonish his son. If he had done prior, it would have been Western. If he had done the latter, it would have been Eastern. By saying nothing, Wenwu affirms Sean's conviction by not affirming it at all. Again, it is a true synthesis. Everything Sean does from this point is free of scrutiny from a cultural standpoint. There is Western in his Easternness, Easternness in his Westernness, a perfect yin and yang. He is free to be both, and rises above both Eastern and Western ideologies without restraint, which is how he wins the day. He is both. He is neither, all at once. Meanwhile, the Dweller in Darkness attacks the Great Protector, causing Sean to need to save Xialing by not letting go. Xialing appeals to Sean's Western side by telling him he needs to let her go, a concept she does not understand. Sean, however, goes to show the audience his newfound synthesis by holding on to Xialing. Now, he is exercising Eastern principles to defend against the Western dragon. Sean is free to interchange between the two, now that he has achieved his true synthesis. This is the culmination of his character arc. In reference to the Western dragon, when it attempts to suck the soul of the Eastern dragon, a comment is made that was addressed earlier in the essay. This is not, as some outlets have stated, a message that the Chinese dragon, or Communist China, must overpower the Western dragon, or the West. Shang-Chi has made direct reference already to running from the CCP.
Why Gong didn't move here from Hunan so you could park cars for a living.
And to a Chinese experience that is not mainland in the slightest. In other words, to the second-generation immigrant, if you allow any part of your Western or Eastern side to overshadow the other, you will be lost. You must synthesize the two. Not by living as a mix of the two, but by making sure your Western synthesis itself is done and defended by Eastern methods. In the beginning of the film, Sean tries to hide his martial arts prowess from Katie, leading to her anger. That was his Western side, eclipsing his Eastern side. Katie herself finds this as well, bringing honor to her family like her mother wished she would by shooting the Dweller in the Darkness to subdue it. It may not have been in the way her mother wished. She doesn't do math, she's not a doctor, accountant, or lawyer, but she does slay dragons. Again, it is synthesis. Do a Western act in service of an Eastern concept. Sean comes out victorious, having not killed his father after all, or in other words, having never given in to one of his sides, but instead finding true, deep balance.
The combining of courage that sets a man's soul on fire!
You know, like my client idealistically wanted, I do sometimes wish that my ethnicity could be tied to a specific culture. It would be simpler that way. Alas, I am simply a bag of meat with black hair and squinty eyes. What I choose to be and do on the inside is my own choice. Like Sean, I feel torn between two worlds. I can hide one and emphasize the other, or I can synthesize the two deeply and truly. At one point in my life, I was so cynical about this that I would even make snide comments like, oh, I'm Western when I need to be, and Eastern when I need to be. Society has forced this on me, so I'll do what I want with this framework that I can exploit. The fact that I use society in the way Joaquin Phoenix intended it to be used in a post-Joker world unironically aside, this is no way to live. Instead, Shang Chi presents a healthy way to the second-generation immigrant to put aside the idea that you have enough of one culture to not belong to the other, but not enough to belong anywhere, showing that if you address your motivations for why you act the way you do and purify the soul of cultural synthesis into a truly Western and Eastern act, you too can beat your dragons and become the one to rise above your Eastern and Western ideologies. Is that not art that we can all agree with? Alternatively, I'm crazy. This movie has no idea what sorts of conflicting ideologies it's juggling and is a mess of contradictions that eventually devolves into a battle between two CGI monsters with zero thought put into the subtext besides, wow, cool Asian! But psych! Because I invoke my good friend and stand power, Roland Barth! You cannot question me! I am a fraud hack! Doigin!